Everyone, please give a warm welcome to our speaker today, Jonathan Lustas. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, and I appreciate everyone being here late in the day. I'm just going to dive right into what it is that I'm talking to you about today and why. So I'm talking about, is the Mafia taking over cybercrime? And why I'm talking to you about that is probably a lot to do with Marlon Brando, to be perfectly honest. Because I think a lot of people's perceptions of organized crime and mafias actually comes from the movies. Now, this is a little bit of a problem because if we think about how, say, hacking or cybersecurity is portrayed in the movies, if that's where we're getting our information from, we have a little bit of difficulty. And the same applies to organized crime. So The Godfather and the trilogy as a whole are fantastic movies. I think there's no doubt about that, but they're not fantastically accurate. And one of the problems we have when we start talking about the mafia and cybercrime, or organized crime and cybercrime, is we have these stereotypes in play, rather than a very, very clear and informed understanding and an empirical understanding of what it is that organized crime groups and mafia groups are, and specifically how do they relate to cybercrime. So I've pulled up two quotes here which illustrate what I think is a somewhat mainstream position at the moment. So I'm not picking on these two quotes, but as you can see in the first one, this quote is making the claim that the mafia is increasingly using the internet as a resource for carrying out mass identity theft and financial fraud. The second quote is quite interesting because it's pinning things on one specific mafia group, which is the Russian mafia, right? This is a very popular group when we talk about organized crime and cybercrime. So they're saying the Russian mafia are the most prolific cyber criminals in the world. Now, these sort of ideas that I hear quite regularly in discussions, I hear them also in interviews that I do with people from industry and elsewhere in security. This is not an uncommon approach to take. But that's the kind of background to what it is that I'm really coming up against to a degree in this presentation today. So what I'm going to do is assess these claims of mafia involvement in cybercrime. But I'm going to try and do it with evidence. And I'm not just interested in what role are traditional criminals playing or conventional criminals playing in cybercrime. I'm interested actually in organized criminals. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit first about what organized crime is and what mafias are, so that we have a little bit of a more informed approach before we get rolling. After that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the evidence that I found in terms of trying to understand what role, if any, these groups are playing in cybercrime. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy angle. So what does this mean in terms of trying to approach this issue? So to let you know a little bit about how I am approaching this, I should tell you a little bit about my background, which is I'm a sociologist. So I'm a social scientist. If people don't know what a sociologist is because you think I'm a psychologist, I'm not a psychologist, just to throw that out there. I think they're much better at branding themselves than sociologists are. So I don't look at the inside of people in terms of what they're thinking, what's happening in their brains, in their minds. I'm actually a sociologist. I look more externally. I'm interested in how they relate to society, how they form groups, how people interact socially, the social networks that they're in. These are the sorts of issues that I'm interested in. And so as part of my approach in trying to understand cybercrime, I've spent the last 7 years traveling to different places around the world, and particularly cybercrime hotspots. So I've listed a few up there: Russia, Ukraine, Nigeria, Brazil, a number of other places, to try and understand how the organization of cybercrime works and to get a bit more of an informed opinion about that. And that's quite a standard way of doing things in sociology, particularly when you're trying to study hidden populations, is to do interviews with people who are very knowledgeable on the issues that you're trying to study. And so what I've done over this time period, over this 7-year period, is to interview 238 different people from law enforcement backgrounds, from the private sector who are involved in tracking this type of activity, and then also former cyber criminals. So the purpose of this is to pull this information together to understand a little bit more about these issues. So this is a very large project. I'm not going to present the whole thing to you today. Most of it will be published later this year. What I am going to do is give you a little preview of one aspect of this, which is this topic to do with the mafia, to do with organized crime, and how it relates to cybercrime. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to tell you about some of the ideas that are already out there in the discourse about what are organized crime groups and what are the mafia. So there is actually an existing discussion going on. We don't have to start from scratch. People have been studying and talking about these issues for a very long time. I've mentioned a few people up there who are relatively well-known academics. So we have Thomas Schelling, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Diego Gambetta, Federico Varese. There's a number of other people working in this field who are trying to really understand how mafias work, how organized crime works, so we don't have to start from scratch in this regard. So coming out of particularly those three names up there, there's a particular school of thought around defining organized crime. So some people define it very broadly, but I'm going to take the approach that these three scholars take, which is a much narrower approach, to try and really understand what is it about traditional organized crime groups that make them different from other groups. So we have a little bit of a kind of cleaner definition to work with. So what this school of thought would say is organized crime and the groups involved in this attempt to govern a criminal market. So if you think about, for instance, a drug dealing group, the idea there would be is you want to be controlling all the drug dealing within the territory that you operate in, right? So if someone else starts to try and deal drugs, you want to drive them out. You want to prevent them from doing this. Or if they're going to continue to do it, you want them to be paying you, effectively a tax, right, upwards, that they're reporting to you, they're kind of under your governance. And that's the key sort of idea in this, is governance, organized crime as a governance of criminal markets. So what is a mafia? A mafia is a very specific type of organized crime group. It's one that actually isn't satisfied with controlling one criminal market, it wants to control all the markets in a given territory, right? So if in this territory you have people dealing drugs, you have people running prostitution, gambling, whatever it might be, a good mafia, they want to monopolize that whole industry, all those industries, right? They want to be the sole provider of protection so that everyone running criminal activities in that territory is going to be under their umbrella. They're going to be paying up to them and they're going to be under their protection. That is what is ultimately driving these groups. So I'm going to bring up another movie because I like movies and I think other people like movies too. And there's a lot of mafia movies. And I talked before about some of these movies being extremely inaccurate. Now, I provide a counterexample of one that actually is accurate, which is Goodfellas. Now, I hope most people are aware of this movie or have seen this movie. I get a little bit depressed because I'm not that old, but when I teach students, most of them are not aware of this movie at all, which I think is weird and a little sad, so I make them watch it, and then I'm not sure if they like it or not. But that's one of the photos from the movie. And that movie is based on a book called Wise Guy. So it's written by a journalist, but there's a lot of input from Henry Hill, who's played by Ray Liotta on your guy's far left. And he was a real mobster. He was in the Mafia. Well, he wasn't a made member of the Mafia, but he was a kind of low-level but important sort of worker within the crime family that he was associated with. And that movie, Goodfellas, actually captures in the narration a lot of what he says directly in this book. And so I have this quote here, which is a kind of street-level definition of what I've been talking to you about before, which is organized crime as governance. So he's talking here about Paulie, and Paulie is wedged between De Niro and Joe Pesci there, if you're not familiar. So he's the local captain in the Mafia group in the neighborhood that they're in. And so he's quite an important figure in terms of organized crime in the area. So the quote from the movie and also from the book is, the guys who worked for Paulie had to make their own dollar. All they got from Paulie was protection from other guys looking to rip them off. That's what it's all about. That's what the FBI can never understand, that what Paulie and the organization offer is protection for the kinds of guys who can't go to the cops. They're like a police department for wise guys, right? So basically they are governing the criminal underworld. That is what the Mafia do. So if we turn our attention quickly to the Russian Mafia, because as I mentioned before, that's one group that people are very, very interested in when it comes to cybercrime. They talk about, I think, more regularly than they do in relation to other organized crime groups. So here I'm responding to the perception which I encounter quite commonly, which is the Russian Mafia is basically people who do bad things in Eastern Europe somewhere. That's kind of some of the discourse that I come up against from time to time. So I want to give you a clear idea actually of what the Russian Mafia is on the ground. So the reality is a little more complex and a little more defined than this very broad approach. So I'll introduce you to the idea of the Vori. So Vori, basically, the full translation of the Russian means thieves in law, right? So the Vori are very, very important to understanding the Russian Mafia. So if we look here, the two images I have are, you can see here the tattoos, and this is something that is very, very important to Vori culture. So in particular, the star you can see there, is actually a very, very important symbol in signaling that you're a member of this group. Now, the Vori basically came out of the Soviet prison system. They came out of the gulags, right? So they were effectively responding to the situation that they were in. They developed a code of honor. They very much dislike authority. And they've spread this outside of prison and become a very, very key part of what we would call the mafia there, right? So we're not just talking about random criminals and people who are violent or whatever it might be. We're actually talking about a criminal fraternity, one that you have to join, that there's a ritual to join. They call it a crowning ceremony, right? To become basically a boss in this particular mafia group. So there are other people associated with mafias in Russia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. But actually, when we're talking about this, we're really talking about a specific criminal fraternity. And I think that's very important to make this discussion a little more defined. So in terms of where they came from, where the Russian mafia came from, really what we're looking at is in the 90s, the Soviet Union has collapsed. It moves towards a free market economy, right? And in this time, we have a lot of new economic opportunities, right? So everything becomes for sale, everything becomes something that can be private property in a way, but you need that property to be enforced. You need agreements to be able to be made and enforced effectively, and you need to have some type of certainty so that you can do business. Now, the problem is at this time you have a very weak state. You don't have police, a court system that can actually enforce a lot of these deals at the time. And so you get the emergence of strongmen who provide this service in an alternative fashion to what would be provided by the state. And this is really the emergence of the mafia in this time period. And so a lot of the interviews I've done in the region, they refer to the 90s guys, right? And that is these people who emerged at this time to perform this very important role. Now, what is the mafia today in this region? It's actually more accurately a post-Soviet mafia rather than a Russian mafia because it's spread throughout the region. And in fact, you get in countries like Georgia a very, very strong mafia connected to this broader mafia. And in Russia, you're actually seeing the state reassert its control in a number of these areas. So you're getting less opportunities for these groups to operate. So that's a kind of important background in terms of what we're actually talking about here. So I'm going to give you a quick case here, which I think is probably the most famous case involving the so-called Russian mafia. So some of you might have encountered this before. For others, it might be new. This is a very early case, actually, in the history of cybercrime. So it's known as the Citibank hack or the Citibank heist or whatever you might call it. And it involves a Russian man called Vladimir Levin who managed to access the Citibank systems. Now, there's different accounts as to whether he did this himself or whether there are others involved and he was just the one who operationalized this. Now, why this case is interesting to us is he figured out how to transfer millions of dollars out of Citibank. Now, you then needed a network of money mules who are based in different countries around the world, in the US, in Israel, and Holland, and you needed some sense of how this would be enforced. And so in this case, what I found through the research that I did is actually the Tambov gang, which is a Russian mafia group in St. Petersburg, was in charge of running this money mule network and enforcing arrangements there. So this is a clear case where we have a known mafia group actually involved in a case of cybercrime. And so that's quite important. So they're using their skill sets. They're good at being violent effectively. That's what they're trained to do. That's what they're good at doing. And so to enforce the money mules, to make sure that money was paid, and also when a number of them were arrested, they come into action with either paying for legal fees, and in other cases threatening people if they're going to potentially provide evidence against them. Now, in this case, the gangsters at the very top did not get arrested, and so they managed to avoid jail time there. So, in terms of the findings, we had this sort of early case. Are we seeing a broad takeover today? Are we seeing groups like this post-Soviet mafia? Are we seeing other groups, more broadly, other organized crime groups, taking over cybercrime completely, according to some of these claims? So I don't think so. I don't think we're seeing a broad takeover, to give you the short answer. So the answer is no. What we are seeing is some involvement, but not in every case. And in fact, a lot of the former cyber criminals I've spoken to really don't want to be involved with organized criminals. And it's probably not that hard to understand why, if you think about it. So I've put these are actually quotes, I'm not labeling people. So we have on one side street guys, right? You got to think about some of these mafia guys, some of these organized criminals. We like to think of them in a global way. There's sort of this octopus-like conspiracy where they're all over the world just pulling the strings. In reality, they're very rooted within local contexts, right? They come from a certain place, they know people locally, And the skills that they have, as I mentioned, which is violence, toughness, these types of things, are best demonstrated in a local context where you can hurt people who are near you, right? It's much more difficult to hurt people in a totally different jurisdiction. So we're talking about these street guys collaborating quite widely with so-called nerds. As I said, this is also quotes. I'm not labeling people. I'm a bit of a nerd, so we can all fall under that term. So in this case, you get this problem where if you're a sort of technical guy and you're working in cybercrime, do you really want to be in business with an organized criminal? Someone who can do you quite a lot of harm if you are not playing along. And so the interviews that I've done suggest across the world, whether it's in parts of Eastern Europe, whether it's in South America, Asia, and other places, a lot of the former cybercriminals I've spoken to actively trying to avoid dealing with organized criminals where possible. And in a lot of cases where they do deal with them, they want to just do it on a short-term basis. They don't necessarily want to be absorbed into the group because, you know, there's some danger there. And in reverse, I think a lot of these mafia guys and the organized criminals see these so-called nerds as really like a cash cow, as sort of money. It's not always necessarily something that's a long-term relationship. So in terms of the other ways in which we can understand how this interaction is taking place with organized crime and cybercrime, the way this occurs is really through a matching of the skill sets of organized crime into cybercrime. So what it suggests to you is they're going to get involved in ways that make sense based on what they're good at. They're not going to suddenly become hackers. They're not going to suddenly become programmers and coders because these are street guys, right? That is not their skill set. So they're going to get involved in ways that make sense for them to get involved. So what I've pulled out here is 4 ways that I've come across through this research as to how they involve themselves. The first one is a logical way because, as I was talking before about governance, this is effectively what mafias do and what organized criminals do, is they govern criminal markets. Now, there are some known cases of this. I think probably the best one I've come across is in Brian Krebs' book Spam Nation, where he talks about a group in Belarus, an organized criminal group that was associated with Alexander Rybatsky, who went on to be quite a key player in the Russian business network. And this group provided some degree of protection, it seems. Now, in the research that I did, I was actually quite surprised how I didn't come across this type of arrangement that often. Came across sometimes you would see protection being provided by organized criminals to cyber criminals, but in a lot of cases I just did not find it. I was a little bit surprised by that, but that's what the findings are. The next 3 roles that can be played are basically outside that governance function. So this is organized criminals playing a role within cybercrime rather than trying to govern it as an industry. So the second one I found is investing in cybercriminal schemes. This one's quite easy to understand. You're a cybercriminal, you're running some type of enterprise, you need some capital, whether it's to hire some people, whether it's to buy equipment. Again, I came across some instances of this, but I didn't come across a huge number. The last 2 were where I saw the most cases, where I came across the most instances where there seemed to be a genuine organized crime role within cybercrime. So C, the first one there, is that these groups, these organized crime groups, would be service providers or partners to broader cybercrime operations. And where I'd suggest this is quite commonly seen is on the money side. So I mentioned before in terms of this Citibank case, they were involved in running this money mule operation. And that's something where you can see that is what organized criminals would be good at. You know, they're used to managing people, they're used to threatening people, they're used to keeping people in line, they're used to dealing with money. In other aspects, they're used to money laundering and these types of things. So this is a logical area for them to get involved with. And I've seen this with these sort of high-level groups, and I've also seen it with sort of street gangs getting involved in different aspects of cashing out and in money mule operations. Of course, there are many different operations on this money side of things that don't involve organized criminals as well, but that's somewhere where I've seen this relatively commonly. And so the final one is related to that, in that you're seeing organized criminals get involved in cybercrime as the guiding hand, which is basically recruiting the technical talent to help them carry out these operations. And so that they're kind of 2 sides of the same coin in a sense. Instead of the technical operator needing help on the cashing out side of things, you see these organized criminals basically recruiting people to do what they need to run the scheme. So as I mentioned, category D was most commonly reported to me, and specifically by former cybercriminals. So a lot of them told me about different instances where they were approached, where people came to them and made an offer to them. Now, as it happens in a lot of these cases, these offers might not have actually related specifically to cybercrime. right? So what I saw a lot of, occasionally I did see cases where it was, you know, a cybercrime operation very clearly, whether it was some type of credit card fraud or whatever it might be, and there would be a recruitment of technical actors to help with this task. But in other cases, they were just doing what they usually do. So they were running prostitution, they were running drugs. I came across an attempted jewelry heist where they wanted a hacker to crack the alarm system so that the heist could be carried out more effectively. But this really is not so much cybercrime. This is using technology to enhance the existing organized crime operations. So a well-known example you might have come across in the media, which I won't go into too much detail, was the Antwerp port hack from a few years ago, which was basically drug traffickers moving drugs, hiding them in containers, coming through the port. And so they needed to recruit some technical talent to basically hack into the port system so that these containers could be removed before the true owner claimed them, right? So they could basically get the drugs out of them. So that's an example of this. So overall, what I'm suggesting to you is organized criminals are not taking over cybercrime in a broad way. They're getting involved, but they're not dominating the market, dominating the industry. And what I encountered far more often than this was really actually a kind of new class of entrepreneur, which is I came across in a number of instances people who looked to me that they could be operating in a legitimate industry. They're just doing it in a criminal industry instead. So you're seeing people who look like entrepreneurs, you're seeing people who look like programmers, and some of them are the same people working legitimately as programmers. And so you are really seeing more of a business rather than this sort of organized crime takeover. And in terms of the protection that they're using, what I actually found was rather than getting protection from organized criminals, they were often seeking it very commonly, actually, surprisingly commonly, from law enforcement agents, from politicians, from others who had the power of the state behind them, right? And so I think the reason for this is effectively that the type of protection that is useful for cyber criminals is ultimately protection from arrest, right? Because in a lot of cases, while they might be competing with each other, online particularly, there's not always a territorial component, right? So they don't necessarily need someone who's going to arbitrate the disputes between them and another cyber criminal group. It does happen from time to time, but in a lot of cases what they really want is protection from arrest. And the people who are in the best position to do that are the ones that are arresting people. And so, you have arrangements with them. I don't have time to go into too much. I can answer in questions if you like. But that's where this is happening. So ultimately, in terms of policy, there's some big picture thinking that has to happen here. So if this cybercrime takeover by organized crime was true, this would basically suggest to us that ultimately dealing with cybercrime is purely a law enforcement problem. There's not really much else we can do other than attack it with that approach. But if we see cybercrime as a different problem, which it still remains a law enforcement problem, obviously, but it's also a problem of underemployed entrepreneurs, underemployed programmers in different regions around the world. And so then we can think about different initiatives to try and solve that problem. Now, why I mention this as big picture thinking is because these are difficult problems to solve, but I think it's important to have a discussion about it nonetheless. So some of the things I've thought about are, having initiatives to provide startup capital, because when I talk about these people as entrepreneurs, some of them, that's one of the difficulties they have in creating a legitimate business is that lack of capital to be able to do it, and they can make much quicker money through criminal endeavors. In terms of hiring, we can start thinking about hiring from affected regions. So I'm not going to go into the whole debate about hiring former or current cyber criminals. I think there's a lot of issues to be discussed there that are very relevant and important. But just purely hiring from countries that are producing a lot of cyber criminals actually should act to reduce the talent pool available for the criminal industry there. And finally, corruption, as I mentioned, in terms of protection is a big problem. So this is obviously very big picture thinking, but trying to address corruption in certain countries around the world would probably help reduce cybercrime in certain ways, but certainly a very big challenge. Now, in terms of takeaways, what has been the whole point of this? What have I been talking to you today? Is really to try and dispel some of the rumors around organized crime, mafias, and cybercrime, because I think that's what a lot of the discourse is based on currently. And when we look at the actual involvement of organized crime and cybercrime and how it's not involved, it's much more nuanced, it's much more organic, and it actually makes quite a lot of sense, I think, when you get down to it. And finally, as I was mentioning before, I think this can somewhat change the way we think about the problem and potentially offer different ways that we could approach it. So it's not purely a law enforcement problem, but also becomes something that can be dealt with through other innovative solutions. So I'm going to end things there. If you want, I've have a white paper which is on the Black Hat site. It's a little bit, not the full length, I can't fit everything into it, but it's a little more detailed than what I've talked to you about today, and that's my personal site as well. But thank you very much. So I'm not sure if we have time for questions, or, I mean, I'm happy to talk on the side, or we can do official questions on which one's the nod for. We're out of time, so anyone who wants to chat, I'll be here or somewhere nearby. Thank you very much.